We're rolling tape.
So were you born in Newfoundland? Is that your...
Yep. The last of the pre-Confederate babies, I guess, or one of the last of it, yes. I was born, 38, in a little place called Kittavity, most easterly settlement on the North American shelf. So if you walk out my front door and kept walking, you'd hit Ireland. That's the next stop. Yeah.
So I guess in those early days when you were growing up, there wasn't a great deal in terms of theatre. I mean, what was your first, exposure to live theatre growing up in Newfoundland?
Not very much at all. I mean, a couple of local amateur groups, and primarily in school, putting on the concerts and that sort of thing. Until the 50s, when a group called the London Theatre Company came, and they operated out of the auditorium in our school, and they did weekly rep in Newfoundland for, just on 10 years, I think it was, about 10 years. And they would come over in the fall on the old Furnace Woody boat. They would come out of Manchester, I guess, and pull into St. John's and load their stuff up to our school. And they performed once a week right through until, usually I think it was the week before Holy Week, whatever that movable feast was each year. And they did everything. There was nothing that those guys didn't do. It was quite remarkable stuff. So that was an education. That was like going to theatre school.
Was the community quite supportive of did they get involved in, the helping the theatre group get established?
Oh, tremendously so. They had corporate sponsors before the concept was even invented. I mean, people helped them with accommodation. They helped them, with contra deals. There wasn't a stone that these guys didn't turn to make sure it happened. And they went along right through, I think they went through to 50, 55, 56, 57, somewhere around there. And what ended up killing them was the introduction of television, and people burning out. They worked very, very hard.
Do you remember your first encounter with Leslie Yeoh, or just in terms of your impressions of her?
Oh yeah, Leslie I remember very, very well. And I don't know why, but my image of Leslie now is still the image that I had of Leslie back then in the 50s. I used to pip off class, we used to call it, to get down and watch rehearsals, or down at the bottom of the gymnasium they would be painting the scenery and that, or I'd sneak up in the balcony and watch them do dress rehearsals and that. And Leslie was always around. Leslie seemed to direct half of the shows, and Oliver Gordon directed the other half. And the thing I always remember about Leslie was that I was a small kid, couldn't have been more than grade 8, grade 9. And I always had questions about why they were doing this or that. And he never, ever sloughed me off. He always answered the question. And when I ended up running the theatre years later, and we'd be loading out in places, trying to get out of there before 1 o'clock in the morning, and the kids would come up and ask questions, which I did not want to get into answering at that particular point in time. I always used to remember Leslie Yeoh, and he was a good teacher and a fabulous director.
Do you have any sort of, I don't know what the word is, I guess memories of certain productions that stand out any more than others?
I have one of a restoration comedy they did. I think it might have been School for Scandal, with Joseph Shaw, who also went on to become a staple in theatre companies across this country and television. And Joe had a quick change, and I was watching them do a rehearsal, and Joe went off and was supposed to do his quick change, and it went on and went on and went on, and he was late coming on, and he came on and saying, Leslie, or to whoever, I mean, this is just impossible. I need help. I cannot do this quick change. This is just not possible. And at the opening, there were no previews. They had the opening, and off he went. And I was watching the opening. Off he went. And the next thing I heard from off stage was, "You see, I told you we couldn't do this goddamn change." And then a minute or two later on, he came with another costume on. So there were all kinds of those kinds of things which happened over the years.
I guess those things happen.
They still happen.
Yeah,
they still happen. Yeah.
So there was a bit of a leap after that, I guess. You left Newfoundland.
Yeah, I left Newfoundland. My idea was, I knew by the time I was finished high school that I wanted to get involved somehow or other in the arts in some way or other. And my idea was that I would go to Ryerson and take radio and television arts, because that seemed to be the coming thing. And so I went and had a talk to my dad about it, and he allowed as he wasn't going to support this endeavor. What am I going to do? End up being a bloody radio announcer, you know? And so he said I should think about what I wanted to do. So I went back to school and looked at the calendar for Ryerson again, you know, and saw the first thing in the thing was business administration. I thought, oh God, that's the idea. I'll go up and enroll in business administration. Halfway through the year, I'll switch. So I went back to my father and said, I've had my epiphany, you know, I know what I want to do. I want to do business administration. And he said, that sounds like a reasonable thing to do. Now pick another place to do it. I said, why? And he said, well, because you'll go up there and halfway through the year, you'll change. So I went back to school and went into the Master's Common Room where all the calendars for the universities were, and I happened to pick up this one from the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. And it had an indoor swimming pool. There was a picture of an indoor swimming pool, which was a real novelty. A kid from Newfoundland. And it had business administration. So decided I would go to the University of New Brunswick. And when I went there, I got involved in the Drama Society, and that really, I guess, determined the rest of my career.
And actually, I think I have in my notes here that one of the people, Alvin Shaw, was that at that time that you met Alvin?
Yes, I went to audition. They were doing a production. I went home at Christmas. I had a lousy first term. I went home at Christmas, and I was determined that I was not going to go back. And I went to see my mentor at the school, Charlie Grant, who was my high school teacher. And I told Charlie I wasn't going to go back. And Charlie literally put me up against the wall and called me names and said, look, you know, go back. Don't give up on this year. Do this year. You know, what's the matter with you? You're lonely. You're homesick. And yeah. He says, and Charlie said, well, you used to be involved in the drama. You know, you used to be involved. They must have a drama club or something up there. He said, go back, get involved in the drama club and do something. So I went back. I was afraid Charlie was going to beat the hell out of me. And there was an audition notice up for a production of The 7-Year Itch. So I went along on this Wednesday evening and waited in line up the stairs into this big room where this man and somebody else was sitting there, and they passed me something to read, and I read something, and I started to leave, and they asked me if I'd wait outside, and I waited outside and waited for a while, and then somebody came out and said, we'll give you a call. So off I went, and a day or so later I got a call asking me if I'd come back and read again. So I went back a couple of days later, and they gave me a small non-speaking role in the show. Years later, when I got to know Alvin, I said, you know, what was all that about? All that audition time? And he said, well, when you left the room, I turned to Mike Gordon, who was auditioning with me, and I said, did you understand anything that guy said? And Mike said, no, not a word. He said, we better have him back and have another listen. And apparently my accent was pretty strong. So anyway, they put me in a non-speaking role, and Alvin was one of those guys who believed you had to do everything. So he started everybody off washing flats, and that was the days when you used to paint flats with water-based paints and then scrub them afterwards and repaint them for the next show. So through the Drama Society, I did just about everything that you could do in a theatre, and it stood me in good stead. And Alvin became a mentor. I went off after 2 years of business administration and switched to philosophy. And that became my academic career, and that's what I did my BA and my MA, and I got a Commonwealth scholarship to go to Australia and went there for 3 years to work on my doctorate. But all the time I worked in theatre, and I worked in theatre in Australia, and I had been teaching for 2 years philosophy in Newfoundland when I got a call from Alvin, who was on the board of this new Beaverbrook Auditorium, which had opened in '64. They said they were looking for a new general manager of the Beaverbrook Auditorium, and he thought that maybe I might be interested in applying for it. And so I thought about it because I enjoyed teaching, and decided if there was a possibility of getting a theatre company going, that I might be interested in that. So I talked with Alvin about it and applied. And for better or worse, got it. So that's when I had to make the decision and moved out of the academic world and in the theatre full time.
And that was around 1964?
No, that was 63 to 66. I was in Australia 60. Yeah, June of 68. July 68, I moved to Fredericton and took over this relatively new building. It opened in 64. 1,000-seat auditorium, no fly gallery, no production facilities in it. And I knew from my experience in New Brunswick that if I wanted to start a theatre company, that there was no way that there was a critical mass large enough in Fredericton to support it. So right from the beginning it would have to be a touring company. And touring didn't hold any great fear for me. You know, ignorance is a wonderful thing. And we used to pack up sets and go off to festivals and that, the old DDF, so I thought, hey, what the heck, you know, it's the same sort of thing. And when I accepted the job, I talked to the board about establishing the company, and they said, no problem at all, as long as it doesn't cost any money. And so then we had to start trying to put together some money to get it going.
What were your first impressions arriving on the scene in Theatre New Brunswick in terms of what had gone on in the past few years and what you were faced with?
Yeah. Well, there was no Theatre New Brunswick. That didn't happen until January of 1969, when that company was formed. The building had opened in '64, the fall of '64. There's a gentleman named Alexander Gray who was the general manager of the building, and he had established a local company called, I think, the Company of 10, and he would complement that with a professional now and then and bring it in, and he was English trained, and so pantomime was big in his tradition. He would do a Christmas pantomime with a lot of locals, bring in who were then very young, sort of beginning stars. Catherine McKinnon, I believe, was one. Bruno Gerussi was in a show there. Bruce Gray, who's now doing Traders, was there. The little girl in the box office was brought on to do a walk-on. Her name was Sharon Pollock, who went on to do a few other things in the theatre in this country. So there were all these people around, and the Company of 10 went for, I think, about 2 years or so. And then Gray left, and then a chap named Brian Swarbrick, who was a journalist and who had written a play, which I think he had done at the Royal Alex in those days. But anyway, Swarbrick came there, and Swarbrick did a summer season where he mounted shows produced locally. Bruno came in for that, Sean Mulcahy, Anna Cameron. Those people came in the summer and did that show. I worked one summer sort of as their production manager and PR director while I was teaching at the university in Fredericton, a drama course. And I think Brian did 2 summers, and then I came in the next year, which would have been the year 4, '68. So there had been no real attempt to establish a full-time professional company, and I don't think that was from a lack of desire to have one. I think probably the only thing that I had going for me was that I had some idea of the provincial scene and the people who had been involved in the old DDF, and the idea of plugging into that. And so that was the idea that I hit upon. So I spent the fall of 1968 going around the province, talked to every service club that I could get. I had done a very detailed budget, and got them to give guarantees. And I mean, we're talking pittances of guarantees. We're talking $1,200 a night in those days. I mean, you know, now you're looking at $12 grand a night minimum. So I managed to get a week of touring plus the 4 or 5 days in Fredericton, going in that first year to 5 other towns, and that was the beginning of it. And little did I ever think that it would last as long or grow as big as it has.
In terms of putting your company of players together, how did that come about when you first took over?
Well, the first thing I did was go to Toronto and sit down with a man named Larry McCanns. Larry was the man who ran Equity, and it was still an American branch plant in those days. And operating on the premise that like the wolf, that when you're attacked, the thing to do is just lie off and offer your throat. Then the wolf would probably not eat your throat. I went into the wolf's den, Larry McCanns, and said, hey, I want to try to get this company going. Any help you can give me? I want to do it as an equity company, as a professional company, blah, blah, blah. So Larry said, great. He gave me lots of advice, and he put me in touch with a couple of people to talk to. I talked to a few people. I went across the country. I stopped off at various theatres and met with people who, I went down to Halifax and had seen Leon Major and knew Leon from a few years before. I went out to MTC and sat with Tibor Verghese, who was an institution, and talked with Tibor. I came to Vancouver. I can't remember who was in Vancouver in those days. It was after Malcolm's, probably Joy Coghill. But I talked to a lot of people about what was going on, and then I went back, and I'd done the summer, done the first summer, and a gentleman named Vern Chapman had been very, very helpful. And Vern had been involved in a lot of theatres around the country. And Vern was very helpful in the mechanics of putting together people and putting together rehearsal schedules and all of that. First time I'd ever used colored pencils to work out rehearsal schedules. And Vern knew a lot of people. He was on the executive of Equity, which he continued to do for many, many years. So that summer was a really, really great training ground. And the importance of getting people together who could work under fairly trying and difficult circumstances. That lesson came through very, very much. The importance of a stage manager, which is not something that you bump into as much in community theatre as you do in professional theatre. And I was very fortunate in the first stage manager I hired for Theatre New Brunswick was a really, really experienced stage manager. It's a chap named Jim Swan who had worked with the National Theatre of Great Britain. And I don't know if the name rings a bell, but Jim subsequently ended up having a career with CBC as a director and producer at the CBC. He did a lot of the directing of series like Up at Hour, Gift to Last, and things like that. But Jim, I met through a man named Walter Massey in Montreal when I was auditioning there. And I tried to explain to Jim how primitive circumstances were going to be, because we were playing in high school gymnasiums that had, you know, a stage at one end, that kind of thing as well. Some of them were auditoriums, but for the most part they were pretty primitive facilities, and the lighting facilities and all of that, dressing rooms, nothing of that. So I tried to explain to Jim how primitive it was. And he said, oh yeah, you know, I'm used to that, blah, 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 blah. So he came down a couple of weeks early, and I took him on a tour. And as we approached the first town, which was St. Stephen, Jim was very talkative and quite down. And then we saw that first, which was one of the better facilities. And then he started to get a little silent. And then as we hit the next place, which was Woodstock, and then we hit the next place, suddenly the conversation just sort of stopped dead, as this man just thought, how in the name of God are we ever going to put shows on, you know, one night after another after another? But we did, and he stayed with us 2 or 3 years and laid the groundwork in a standard of professionalism that stood us in real good stead.
When you were traveling across the country and talking to the other theatres, were you looking actually at actors that you were going to consider your company? Or?
Well, I tried to see as many actors as I could. I tried to organize my trip so that they had shows on in places, so I saw. And I did meet actors that I ended up working with and designers that I ended up working with. I remember in Calgary, I think Chris Newton might have been there then. And there was a young lady from England designing for him named Sheila Toy. Sheila ended up being my resident designer for about 4 years and ended up immigrating to Canada, setting up, and has become one of the premier designers of pewter in North America, and has got a business and employs about 35, 40 people.
So you came back. Now, often when a professional theatre sort of establishes itself in a community, the amateur theatres are a little upset. The actors that have been around, there's almost an expectation that they will carry on. Was that within the professional company? Was that a problem for you? Or?
No, I don't think so, because we didn't have that many, and most that we had, there was a relatively strong local group in Moncton. There was one in St. John. Less so in Fredericton. The Drama Society at the university was the principal stay of non-professional theatre. And in the first season, we used the resources of the university. I mean, we borrowed their lighting board. We borrowed their instruments. And in fact, in one of the shows, we co-produced it with the university to supply additional bodies on the tour. So there was some kind of a cooperation there. I think probably a little less so in Moncton and St. John in those days. But that died pretty quickly. So I don't think that was a problem.
In terms of touring is always a challenge, and I have spoken to several people about their touring memories and some of the challenges they face in different theaters, and they inevitably have a few memories that stand out more than others in terms of.
I'd love to know who you talked to and what they told you. Oh Lord, there are so many. There are so many that are printable and not printable. But well, one of the funniest ones for me is Jim Swan, who was the stage manager. One of the things which the stage manager had to do in those days was to drive the 5-ton truck, because we put everything in a 5-ton truck. And I'd asked Jim if he had a driver's license. He said, oh yeah. Well, when he got to New Brunswick, we found out that all he had ever driven was a motorcycle, a moped. So he had to get a license, and he tried in Fredericton to pass a driver's test and just failed miserably. And finally, we were coming up just a few days before we were going out on tour, and a friend arranged for him to go to St. Stephen, where the local inspector was a little less difficult. And Jim went down and got his pass, got his license. So he came back, and the night that they loaded the truck for the very first tour, we had miscalculated and we still had stuff left over. So we had to run off the next morning and get one of those U-Hauls and put on the back of the 5-ton truck. And our box office lady had to travel in the truck with Jim, the stage manager. And Audrey Campbell, then the story picks up as they're heading out in mid-January, because the season opened on January the 16th. They're heading down to St. Stephen, and Audrey tells the story that she's very nervous with Jim driving, but he's doing pretty well, and they're coming around a curve, just a gentle curve, and it's very icy, very icy. And as they're going around, she sort of looks up and she suddenly sees this U-Haul trailer going by, and she turns to Jim, she says, "What? There's a U-Haul trailer just like ours." And Jim looks at it. That is ours. And it goes along, and it had all the lighting equipment in it. It went along until the other curve hit and just went up in the snowbank and tipped over. So about 10 minutes later, the car with the actors and that is coming along, and we find them out there sitting there on the side of the road waiting for somebody to come along to lift them out. That's one. Another truck. We had so many accidents with so many trucks that rental firms started not to want to rent to us because we were having such trouble. And I went aboard Jim one time and said, "Look, you really have got to be very, very careful with the crew and make sure that the trucks are looked after and no accidents. And I just don't want to keep getting calls in the middle of the night saying we've lost the truck this and lost the truck that." And we were playing at St. John at the old vocational school, which was up on about 132 steps up to a loading area going into it, and the steps led all the way down to sort of the main street, Douglas Avenue, going along there. And they used to bring the truck in and turn it around and then take the stuff off onto the upper steps. Well, I had left the theater after the show. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf we were doing. And the empty truck came to be loaded. And Bud Wheeler was driving the truck. And it was a sleet night, a real sleet night, wind blowing like crazy. And they opened the back doors, and Bud went to go in to tell them ready to load. And a gust of wind came by, and it overcame the inertia of the truck. And the truck started to go down these 132 steps. And Bud just ran after the truck, got in, put his foot in the brake, and realized, of course, that the brake was on. I was going to sneeze. I've been going to sneeze for the last 5 minutes. There you go. So we got that out of the way. Bud jumped in. He's sitting there, going down 132 steps, pressing the brakes, realized the brakes are on, the foot brakes are on. There's nothing he can do. Why is he sitting in this 5-ton truck going down? So he jumps out, and the truck keeps coming down. He suddenly looks down and realizes there's traffic going back and forth on the main street down there. So he runs down, stops all the traffic, and waits, and the truck comes down, comes right across the road, and parked right across the road. There's a Ford Galaxy 500 and another car, which I can't remember what it was, and the truck just went into the two of them and just tore them apart. It wrecked the undercarriage of the truck totally and completely. I'm home in bed. I get up the next morning, 7 o'clock, we're leaving for the next gig. I come out, there's no truck. I don't see our truck, because our truck's not leaving until 7:30. I walk into the restaurant, or the hotel, or the motel, and there's all the crew sitting around with these smirks on their face. And there's Jim. I said, where's the truck? He said, not to worry about the truck. We had a small problem last night. I took care of it. And they wouldn't tell me what had happened until finally then I saw this other truck came. And they told me. But we had lots of stuff like that. Lots of stuff like that. It was pretty tough. Coming back after 17 years, it's interesting, going back to TNB, my second incarnation there, one of the things which you do notice is how wonderful the roads are. Because the roads were so bad when I toured there. Yeah.
Okay. Was that a tape change cue or?
No, you were leaning into the shot.
That's the old lean into the shot number cue.
So you've been waiting to sneeze for a while?
Oh.
Did you want to stop for a second and refill your drink there? And
Mentioned by name, but anybody who knows who it was, are having this unbelievable fight next door. And he hears the door slam. And the next thing, he hears a knock on his door. And he opened his door, and there is Ted standing with the dressing gown open, a half erect penis, and Ted saying, Dawn's saying, I've got a small penis. Is this a small penis or is this average? I say it's average. The guy says, well, I think it's average. So Ted goes back in, opens the door and says, Jack says this is average. And Dawn says, what the fuck would Jack know about an average sized penis? Have you seen his? And Ted says, you have? So touring can be hell. Ted tells one wonderful one about routing. Canadian players used to make their money, I mean, they'd lose their money in Canada, but they'd make their money in the States because they'd do the university circuit. And he said, whoever booked the tour was mad because there was one tour that they passed through the same town about 15 or 20 times. And they'd sort of wake up, in the middle of the night and open the window of the bus, and Jesus, they'd be coming through whatever this town was in the Midwest, and put down the blinds again, and off they go. Oh, God. Went to Neptune, $125 a week. I think that's what it was. Married, having kids, $125 a week. And if you were married, you didn't get, the two of you didn't get paid as much as singles. Not politically correct now. Oh. So are we ready?
Yep, we are ready. Okay. So actually, well, why don't you tell, since we were in that vein, why don't you tell me the Barry Morse?
Oh, I was going to tell you the Barry Morse story. Barry came down to do, I think Barry is tremendous, and he's a great man of the theatre and has done a lot for it. He came down to do Scrooge and Christmas Carol after I had left TNB, and for Malcolm Black. And Malcolm didn't have a lot of money to pay, and Barry was quite a good name to catch. So Barry had made a deal with him. I think Barry had basically said to Malcolm, what are you budgeting for sales for this show? And Malcolm said, I'm budgeting X. And Barry said, all right, I will come for this paltry amount that you've offered me, but I want a percentage of everything above X, above what you are budgeted to make on this show. 10, 15, 20%, whatever it is. No. Fine, it's making a difference to me. If I make my budget, I make my budget. Well, Barry traveled in his own car, and Barry would leave early in the morning to get to the next town. He would go to the radio station, he'd go to the local newspaper, he'd go to the shopping malls. Anywhere Barry could go, he would go to drum up business for the show, and the show did really, really well. And it was just a lesson in, that the old approach, what you put in, you get out, and you get a piece of it, and away you go, and you're happy. And people still talk about Barry in New Brunswick.
Yeah, he did the same